morning. It's great to be back. It's been 4 weeks. Can you believe this? I've been gone for 4 weeks. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate that. We took a very much needed vacation with the family. We're in the mountains of North Carolina. Came back. I was supposed to be back on the pulpit here and in Pinecrest last Sunday, but we had a big send-off for our youth that went to camp last week. We had 60-plus teenagers. They went out to camp, and this was a very powerful week for them. They were impacted by God. The stories are coming in amazing. But they asked me, hey, since we're doing this big send-off, can you postpone your return to Key Biscayne and Pinecrest and go to Miami Springs? So I went there. And I've been, since then getting reacquainted with things, getting up to speed with everything else that I need to give my time and my attention to the church and family and school now for the kids and et cetera. And even my training. I don't know if you knew this, but I am preparing right now to compete in a very important jiu-jitsu competition at the end of next month. It's the Jiu-Jitsu Worlds. I have a friend here that is also competing too, Lucas. But I'm training, and I'm back to that. And I love to compete. I wish I had more time to compete. Unfortunately, these competitions happen on weekends. But the reason why I think competition is important is because it allows us to test where we are, to test our skills, to allow us to see actually where are the holes in our game. And there's nothing like being tested. While you're being in testing, your deficiencies, they surface. You're able to see your deficiencies, and therefore, testing does not only allow us the opportunity to overcome them, but the opportunity to grow. No one can grow unless they are being tested. Okay? That happens with sports. That'll happen physically as well. Like you go to your doctor for checkups. What are your doctor requests? Tests. He wants to see your blood work. He wants to check your levels. And unless you are tested, you don't know where you need to improve, the areas of your body that need attention and that need care. Testing allows us to see ourselves for who we are and gives us the opportunity, every single testing, to grow. And it's the same with our faith too. Unless you are going through tests in your faith and you're acknowledging them, you're not able to grow. You're not able to grow as a follower of Jesus. I don't know if you knew this. Maybe you walked in here for the very first time. I've met someone that was walking in for the very first time today. But what we've been doing since the summer began is we're looking at the story of the patriarchs in the Bible. We're looking at the story in the book of Genesis of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And we are learning from their stories. And we know that they are pursuing the promises of God in their lives. And many times they wander and they falter, and many times they give up, and God comes to them, and they wrestle with the promises of God. But we know that they're moving towards those promises. And one essential element in that journey with their relationship with God, as they're moving towards those promises, is the testing that happens and takes place in their lives. And today we're going to read from a part of Genesis where Abraham's faith is tested. I don't know if you remember the content of last week's sermon that Pastor Carter preached. It was in Genesis 18. And we have an insight in Genesis 18 of this tight relationship that Abraham has with God. I mean, who would have God show up at their house in the middle of the day and have lunch with them? Who would be called by God and invited by God into his vision, into his plans? Says, I'm thinking about doing this, and I'm going to let you know, I'm going to give you a heads up ahead of time of what I'm about to do. Who? Abraham had a close relationship with God. The scriptures recognize that. In the book of James, James quotes Isaiah, and he says something about Abraham that is not said about anyone else in the Bible, that Abraham was a friend of God. But here's the question. Does Abraham love God as much as God loves Abraham? Does Abraham put God first as he should, as he reflects upon how God has treated him? This is what this story is about. And so I want to invite you to pay attention to it as we read, and we're going to read from Genesis 22, and we're going to read verses 1 through 14. It's a very famous passage, by the way. It's a passage that is in the Bible, it's also in the Quran, and it's a passage that allows us to see what a life of faith looks like. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offerings and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. And when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. This is the word of the Lord. Like I said, this is a passage that gives us a vision of what a life of faith looks like. What does a life of true faith look like? It looks like a life that's constantly being tested. So today we're going to look at the faith test that Abraham has to go through. We're going to also look at the reason for that test. Why did God test him? And why is God testing us? And why may you be going through a test right now? And then lastly, how do we pass the test? Okay? So let's look at these 3 things today. First, the faith test. It's important that we acknowledge before we get to Abraham's test and the test that God gives Abraham, that we understand that there was also a test that God was undergoing with Abraham. And it's important that we acknowledge that God completely aced that test. I don't know if you were paying attention as we were reading the passage, but right there in verse 22, verse 1 of chapter 22, the very first thing that we read, remember? The very first thing that we read was this expression, after these things, God tested. After these things. What is he talking about? Here's what he's talking about. He's reminding us that God had called Abraham to leave his comfort, to leave his land, and to follow him to a land that he was going to give him. And in that promise, God included a very important component. That was that God intended that land that he was going to give Abraham to be populated. The problem was that Abraham and his wife, they were very old in age, and his wife was barren. She could not bear a son. And God said, here's how I'm going to populate that land. And every land on earth, by the way, through a son that I'm going to give you. And it took many years. It didn't happen right away. God did not give the son overnight. And in that process, Abraham and Sarah, they wandered and they wrestled and they asked the question, is God really going to come through? And there were points, as you know in the story, that they got frustrated and they took matters into their own hands. And they decided to make things happen instead of allowing God to give him the son. They said, we're going to make this son up, right? We're going to do it together. We have a plan here. And it always led to deception and breakdown. And still, in the midst of all of Abraham's failures, as he is grasping, as he is wrestling with the promises, as time is going by, God still manages to never forsake Abraham, to be true to the covenant that he made with Abraham, to love on him and extend grace to him. And God finally, despite his mistakes, despite his shortcomings, despite betraying the God that he was in covenant with, God still gave him Isaac the son. So chapter 22 starts with God being faithful, with God giving the son to Abraham, with God passing the test, because the question that Abraham and Sarah asked is the question that we all ask as we're wrestling with the promises of God in our lives. Can God be trusted? Is God faithful? Will he ever come through? Will he get me out of the pit at some point? Will he give me clarity? Will he give me vision? And God is acing the test, and God always aces the test. He always passes the test because he is loving and he is faithful. And that's what it means actually to be a Christian, is to be confident of that reality, that you are loved unconditionally by the Creator God of the universe. How do I know somebody's a true Christian? It's not by how they perform, by how much money they give or how many Sundays they attend or how many things they do in the church, whether they are sweeping the floors or running the books. It's not any of that. It's, do they believe? Do they truly believe that they are loved by the Creator God of the universe? That's the litmus test, whether you are a Christian or not. God has proven over and over and over again that he is loving and he is faithful. And it comes through this story, and it comes through the stories of our life as well. But now is the question, is Abraham faithful? Will Abraham pass the test? Will you pass the test? When you are tested, when your allegiance to God and your love for God is tested, will you pass the test? I mean, you need to understand the horror of the test that Abraham is given. And most of us have never been tested this way, and Abraham has. And the reason why this is here is so you can see an extreme case of what this test is about and what it looks like, so that you understand every time that you go through something in life and that maybe God is trying to test you and allow you to see where you stand in your relationship with him. What's the horror? Now let's establish something here. The horror of this test is not that God is asking Abraham to kill his son. God is not asking Abraham to kill his son, to murder his son. That's not what God is asking. God is asking Abraham, it's very clear here in the text, to offer up his son. Two very different things. If God said, just kill your son, he could have just walked into the tent with a knife and stabbed his son. That's not what God is asking of him. God has given him very specific instructions. Go to this place, take this, do this. And what he's about to do, what was known back then as how you set up worship, as an act of worship, set up an altar. And I want you to offer up your son. One is breaking the law of God, murder, and the other one is worshiping God. And there's two very different things here. But God is asking Abraham, the son that he had promised for many years, the ultimate culmination and fulfillment of the promise. And we read this story, it's like, oh my gosh, God would come to a point where he would do this to us? And the answer to the question is, no, maybe worse. Because God is not just asking Abraham to offer the son of the promise up back to him, but God is asking Abraham to forfeit his legacy and his lineage. Back in those days, if you did not leave a firstborn, your family line would be chopped off from existence. And what God is asking Abraham is like, hey, I'm not just asking you to give up your son, I'm asking you to be forgotten forever. okay? And that was very hard and very tough for Abraham to come to grips with, because God was asking him something actually bigger than even the life of his own son, which was already an immense sacrifice in itself. But it gets to the heart of every test that is ever presented to us by God. I don't know if you noticed this, but the patterns of this test equals the pattern of Abraham's first test, which was, okay, so if you go to the passage in verse 2, he says, "Go to the land of Moriah and offer him up there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you." When God first showed up to Abraham, what did he say to Abraham? Leave and go. Where? To a land where I'll show you. Abraham, here in the second test, says, hey, what do you want me to do? Go to this mountain. Where in the mountain? I'm going to show you. The pattern is there, and offer up. God is asking in the first test for Abraham to offer up his life and his future in God's hands, and now he's asking to do the same with his son. But the pattern remains the same, and it's the same in our lives as well. Here's the pattern of every test. God says to you, follow me, trust me, and worship me. Follow me, trust me, and worship me. And if you look at anything in your life right now that you hold dear to your heart, that you can't follow God with, that you can't trust him in, and you can't worship him through, then you have failed the test. If your job is so important to you that you can't follow Jesus and pursue that career, because sometimes you have to cut corners, sometimes you have to prey on the vulnerable. If you can't follow him, you're failing the test. If you can't embark in any calling in life and trust that God knows the future instead of you having to figure out the future, you're failing the test. If there's anything in your life right now that you hold important to you, that you can't worship God through, that you can put it on the altar and say, hey, I want to worship you through the upbringing of my children. I want to worship you through my marriage. I want to worship you through this career. I want to worship you through this influence and this power that you have given me. If you can't worship God, but instead you're seeking worship for yourself through these things, then you are failing the test. And now, I hope that you realize that we fail more than overcome the tests that God sends our way to allow us to grow in our faith. I hope you're beginning to understand and to realize this. I mean, our responses and our emotional reactions to when things do not go our way are very telling whether we are acing these tests or we are failing or flunking these tests. When things do not happen according to your way, you lose your mind, you say horrible things, you do horrible things. It reminds me of a story of the great reformer Martin Luther. Martin Luther was an amazing leader. He was the reformer. He reformed Christianity in the 1500s, early 1500s. And because of that, because he had such an important task, he had a lot of critics and he had a lot of people opposing what he did. And one day, he had just received a barrage of criticism, and he sunk into a depression. He was in his room and he would not leave his room. He was depressed because of everything that was said to him and about him. And he said, I'm just trying to do the right thing, and all these people are coming at me. And he would not come out of his room. His wife, Katie Vaughn, that was her name, and she would try to get him out of the room. He wouldn't get out of the room. And one day she had an idea. Do you know what she did? She dressed up in black, all black. And she walked into the room. And back in those days, you wouldn't dress up in black unless you were mourning. And so he asked her, why are you dressed in black? Who died? And she said, you don't know who died? No. She said, God died. What? Yeah. That's why you're like this. Because you are failing to trust and where he is leading you. And the opinions of others have become more important than his opinion of you. And that got him out of the room. But you see, many of us are failing the test just like that because we can't follow, we can't trust, and we can't worship God through the things that we judge important in our life. So that is the faith test that he goes through and the faith test that we all are called to face every once in a while in our Christian journey, in our lives. But I think we must understand as well the reason for the test. What's the reason for the test? And I think that I sort of said something about that in the beginning of the sermon, but I want you to understand that the reason why God tests Abraham, and he tests every single one of us, is to reveal our blind spots. There is a risk here going on. There's a risk that God is trying to mitigate here in Abraham's life, and that is this. There is the risk of Isaac, the son of promise, taking up God's place in Abraham's life, of Isaac entering the center of Abraham's heart, and God being displaced from the center of that relationship. And I'll tell you that that's what I believe it's happening here because of what God says to him in verse 2. Remember, he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Now God speaks that way to Abraham. And it's interesting because if you're familiar with the story, Isaac is not Abraham's only son. We read that he has another son, and his name is Ishmael with Hagar. But why does God say to Abraham, I want you to take your only son? He knows he has another son, and so does God. They're on the same page there. And then God says, your only son, the son of whom you love, because God is getting to Abraham's heart. He says, in your heart, the only person you see is Isaac. He is the only one you got. He is the most important thing to you. He is the one your affections are fully committed to. He is the son you love. See the risk that's happening and taking place? There's the risk there of Abraham being ruined by him giving all of his affections and depositing all his hopes on his firstborn son. There is a risk of derailing all of God's plan, even for us here today, if Abraham had not kept that in check. And he was not noticing that because you don't notice when things are displacing the worship of God in your life. You don't notice. It's kind of like the Lord of the Rings, Smeagol, when he becomes that monster. It's a slow process. And I'm quoting the Lord of the Rings. There's a new series coming out now on Amazon. I hope you watch it. I'm a fan of J.R. Tolkien. But anyhow, it's a slow process. You don't notice. He was a beautiful little hobbit, and all of a sudden you see him as this ugly creature falling apart, and it was his affection towards that ring that slowly turned him into that monster. We don't know that. Abraham couldn't see it, and God says, I want you to stop this. I want you to see where your heart is going. Because at the end of the day, nothing, let me tell you something, nothing besides God can bear the full weight of your hopes. Every foundation that you set up in life is not strong enough to bear the desires of your heart, to bear all of your hopes in life. It eventually will crumble. It eventually will be destroyed. How many of us know of parents that have obsessed over their children, and in the process, they destroyed their relationship with their children, and they've destroyed their children as well? How many people that you know that have obsessed over their careers and over their jobs, and in that process, they've destroyed their health and they destroyed all their relationships. They destroyed their families as well. Anything, this is what this story is teaching us, anything that you smother, anything in life that becomes more important to you than God, anything in your life that you hold a tight grip on will eventually spoil. It's the story of the manna in the desert. You store up the manna, it spoils. Anything you hold too tightly to, you will spoil. There's a friend of mine in our Pinecrest campus that he told me a story, and we're in hurricane season now. I'm thankful to God that we haven't seen even a threat of a hurricane. Praise God, and God, please keep it that way through the end of hurricane season as we continue through. But here's the thing. This friend told me when the last hurricane happened here, I think it was Irma, is that what it was? That we had floods, even in this church, we had a lot of stuff to fix. But anyways, he tells me, he says, hey, listen, I learned a lesson through these hurricanes. And he says, every expensive bottle of wine that I have, I will drink it on the spot. I don't store up anything. And I said, what do you mean? He says, when I bought expensive, this guy likes wine. It's like when I buy expensive wine, when I get him as a gift, I never put in my wine cellar anymore because there was a hurricane that came. I was saving up all these expensive wines, and my house flooded, and I lost all of them. So I now drink everything on the spot. That's what I do. I don't store up anything. And I thought about that as an illustration. Sometimes we're trying to protect these things in our lives, and all we're doing is spoiling them. Because the flood will eventually come at some point in life to your job, to your career, to your relationships. It will come, the flood, and where will it be? C.S. Lewis used to say this, that there is nothing that you haven't given away that will ever be truly yours. And so what's happening here is God is showcasing his severe mercy towards Abraham. He is prying open the claws of the idols that have a grip in Abraham's heart, and it hurts, and it feels sometimes that God is actually against you, and he's destroying it. He wants to ruin your life, but that's what God is doing. It's his mercy at work here. God is liberating Abraham. And Abraham does take his son up that mountain, and he sets up his son in that altar. And we learn in the text that the life of the son is preserved. Isaac doesn't die, but something else dies on that altar, and that is the idol of Isaac. In the altar, it's not Isaac that dies, but the idol of Isaac that dies on the altar. And God sometimes takes you to a point like that in your life, not to kill you as you think he is going to do, not to strip you of all the fun and all the enjoyments, all the delights in life that he's already given you, but to kill the idolatry that is in your heart towards those things. That's what he's doing here with Abraham. It's his love. He does it because he loves us. He wants us free. He wants us to fully enjoy his gifts and his blessings and his promises without these things owning us. And that's what's happening here. And that's what he's doing in our lives as well. So, how do we, like Abraham, are able to pass the test? And let me hit it really quickly here. First of all, it's about learning how to not depend on yourself and depend on God. It's about learning how to not rely on yourself and instead rely on God. What is getting Abraham up that mountain? You don't think that was a hard request? That was a very hard request. It was a very hard, tough test. But what gets Abraham up, what pushes him up that mountain is, it's not the confidence that he has in himself, it's his obedience. Oh, I'm going to ace this test. I absolutely love God, and I'm going to do anything that he asks of me. It's not that pushes him up the mountain. You know what pushes him up the mountain? It's faith. He's not reliant on himself. He's reliant on faith. Later on in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that's exactly what the writer of Hebrews says. So let me read this passage to you. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 and 18. That's what the Word of God says. Sometimes the Word of God delays, but it comes. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, by faith. And he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. See, he knew that God had prepared a provision ahead of time. He did not know about the provision. He did not know what the provision was going to be. That's exactly what he says to his son, because his son says, hey, here, listen, the wood is here, the fire is here. The knife is here. Where is the sacrifice? And Abraham's response to his son is, God will provide, my son. He had faith in the provision of God even before he saw the provision of God. The only thing that will allow you to overcome the tests of life, to ace these tests, to pass these tests, is not how strong and how good you are as a Christian. It's nothing about your faith. It's about your faith in him. What I like to say is the quality of our faith is measured by the object of our faith. It's who you put your faith in that really matters. You say, oh, I trust myself. I'm a self-confident person. No problem. That's actually a good thing. But how many times have you disappointed yourself? But when you put your faith in God, who has always aced the test, who has always proven over and over and over, he's loving, he's forgiving, he's merciful, there you have something that's powerful. And when we continue to read the Bible, we see how God truly provided for us in order to give us the power to go up any mountain and to overcome any tests. The ultimate proof of love was when he sent his true Isaac to us. Who is Jesus but Abraham's true seed? Who is Jesus but the ultimate culmination of the promise of Isaac? He is the ultimate son of Abraham that God actually put on the woods, just like Abraham put Isaac on the woods. And when he cried, the knife still came down on him so it wouldn't come down on us. And it's when you understand and you believe this and you see God's ultimate love for you, it's that love that pushes you up the mountain. And I want to tell you something here today. It's easier for you and I to trust in his love than it was for Abraham. You know why? You know, Abraham gets up to the spot there with his son, and they look around, and they can't see the lamb. Where's the lamb? We can't see the lamb. But you and I can see the lamb because you can look back in history. The lamb has been offered on your behalf. It's easier for you and I to pass this test than it was for Abraham. God lowers the bar for us. That's the truth of the matter. In Jesus Christ, if you today deposit your ultimate trust and faith in Jesus, and if you are reminded of his love today and every day, you will ace every test and you will grow in your intimacy and your relationship with God, which is the ultimate goal and purpose by which we exist and we live. Will you pray with me?